After this situation happened, I really tried to put it behind me. I really didn't want to think about it too much. I mean, I want to be vigilant and have common sense and all, but if I spent too much mental energy on that, I might never go outside. When I was in my 20s, I was on a camping trip with a couple of my friends in Central Florida. 2 of us were rangers for the National Park Service at the time. That gave us the privilege of camping for free in the other parks in the state. We'd all done a lot of camping before. I grew up camping with my family on almost all of our vacations in one form or another. We'd camped all over the state of Florida and were very familiar with the environment. On this trip, we were camping in the youth area since it was empty that week. It was quieter and more isolated than the regular campsites. The first day, we just spent our time reading and relaxing and whatnot. Some of the rangers on duty came by to shoot the breeze with us. When you work for the Park Service, you tend to acquire a lot of weird stories to tell. We hung out for a while, and then me and my 2 friends got busy with our dinner prep. It was a quiet night. The second day, in the afternoon, we were all sort of spread out in the area of the campground. We were all within shouting distance of each other, but also enjoying a little solitude. I was collecting firewood. Every now and then, I started feeling like something was watching me, but it wasn't super uncomfortable, just a weird sensation. I'd look around, but I wouldn't see anything, so I'd shrug it off and go back to what I was doing. Later on, around sunset, we had the bonfire started. One of the rangers who lived on site about a quarter mile away came over with a truckload of firewood and some fish he had caught. We all sat around talking and grilling our food. After dark, when it was about 9, we started hearing what sounded like a bunch of people fooling around on one of the trails a little distance away. Since the trails were supposed to be closed at sunset, the ranger and my coworker drove off to shoo them back to their campsite. My other friend and I were just relaxing around the fire, taking it easy, mostly enjoying the night and the peace and quiet. All of a sudden, I had a cold chill go over me, like someone had just walked over my grave. I was covered with goosebumps. I just started feeling terrified out of nowhere. I tried to ignore it, but it kept building. I didn't want to say anything to my friend in order not to scare her, but then we both looked over at each other at the same time. She said, "Do you feel that?" I said, "Yeah, I think maybe we better go to the car." We both felt like we were in danger, but we had no idea from what. We started walking at a casual pace, not wanting to appear scared. We only made it about 10 yards before I felt something staring at me from behind and to the right. Immediately, my senses went on red alert as I quieted my breathing so that I could listen into the foliage. I could hear a shifting of the environment just beyond the edge of the path. It was subtle, but I could tell by the sound that whatever it was sounded large. My heart started beating faster, but I tried to tell myself I was being too paranoid. I was thinking it might be a boar, or God forbid, a Florida panther, which are rare, but still, people see them once in a while. I could feel the energy moving behind me. I felt like we were being stalked, and I pressed my hand on the fixed blade I had hanging from my belt. I risked a look behind me and saw something pale and thin just off the edge of the path. It was crouched down on all fours. Even in the hunched down position, it was huge. It was at least 6 feet long, almost totally white, without many facial features, except it stared at us with black eyes and an open mouth. It seemed crusty and dry. When I looked at it, it started making a clicking sound. We were about 15 yards from the car when my friend and I looked at each other again and simultaneously broke into a dead run. When we reached the car and jumped in and locked the doors and turned on the headlights, my pistol was in the car and I sat there holding it, but my hands were shaking so badly. We both just sat looking straight ahead. I don't know how long we sat there, but at one point we were both sure we saw something slinking away. It was like we could actually feel that energy pulling away. I called the ranger and tried to describe what we'd seen. He could tell by the sound of my voice that I was seriously messed up. I've never been that scared before or since. I have faced a lot in my life, wandered around the woods and all, and nothing has so completely terrified me like that. I don't know what it was, but I'm still convinced we were in danger. We did end up sleeping on the Ranger's living room floor that night and collected our gear the next day. About 2 years ago, I had to move because I got a promotion and needed to switch cities. I moved from Chicago to San Francisco. I'm a single dad, so it was difficult already, but my kids had a hard time adjusting to the city. It was completely different. Money was tight, so I had to rent a small apartment, and the goal was only to be there for a few months, no longer than a year, until I could upgrade us to a better one. It wasn't a lot, but it was good enough. There was a kitchen, a bathroom, and my kids shared a room while I slept on the couch. We were there for a few weeks when one of my kids began waking me up in the middle of the night because she was having nightmares. This wasn't usual, but I thought it was just stress. She would talk about a tall man who wouldn't let her sleep. Like I said, weird, but stress does things to kids. My oldest was struggling to sleep too, but just said she didn't feel tired. I thought it was jet lag. A week or so later, I came home from work in the early afternoon. I get home before the kids do, so I try to make them their snacks. I was in the kitchen when I heard what sounded like footsteps behind me. There was nothing there, but I thought maybe I heard the neighbors. I turned the stove on, and suddenly it was like I was shoved. My sleeve caught fire, but thankfully I wasn't hurt. When my kids came home that day, my youngest was pale and shaky and had a fever. She spent the whole night screaming and yelling about the tall man. Throughout the night, things just got weirder. Doors opened on their own. Plates were smashed on the ground. The apartment was icy cold and was filled with this awful stench like rotting meat. I decided to take my kid to the ER, and as we closed the door behind us, there was a lot of banging and rattling from inside the apartment. By the time we made it to the ER, my kid was fine. She fell asleep in my arms. We made it back by early morning, and it was beyond trashed. Everything was broken. Pillows were torn to shreds, boxes empty, dressers flipped over. It was awful. This was the start of the hell we would start to live in. Every night the house would be trashed. We lived in constant filth. My youngest began to have behavioral issues that led to her being suspended for trying to attack another student. She became increasingly violent and had to be locked away at night. My oldest had to sleep on the couch with me. I consulted behavioral experts and therapists for her, but nothing helped. As she grew more violent, so did the instances around the apartment. There were times I would wake up to a pillow pressed against my face, the burners on the stove turned on, or the water running while the drains were clogged. After a year, I had enough. I broke the lease and moved us to a little motel for a while. Once again, my youngest became horribly ill and spent hours vomiting. She was sick for a few days, but once she was better, she was no longer violent. She was very calm and back to her normal self. But after a few weeks, it came back. Weird things happened around the motel. She became aggressive and I began hearing and seeing things. I'm not crazy when I say this, but I would see a tall, dark figure out of the corner of my eyes. Sometimes it would just stand there, but other times it would seem to come at me. I began to have awful nightmares where I would see it. Often I would die and wake up sweating and shaky. My youngest began sleepwalking, and I'd often find her trying to leave or grabbing a knife or something. I began to do some research and saw that maybe we were being haunted by a ghost or a demon or some evil being. So I bought some crosses and put them up in the room. Every night, they'd fall to the ground no matter how they were put up. I'd rest it on a dresser and it would end up halfway across the room. Eventually, I tried to contact a local church. Of course, whenever we got there, she was perfectly normal. They tried to ask her questions, splashed holy water, all kinds of stuff, but she didn't react in any way they wanted her to. We took them to the motel room where they questioned her and seemed to try to provoke her once again, but nothing happened. They basically told me she was perfectly fine, but that they'd pray for her. They didn't think anything evil was haunting or attacking us. That night, everything was so much worse. Things were being thrown across the room and my youngest attacked me while she was sleepwalking. She had this inhuman strength. It was like fighting a grown man. I called again and asked for help, but once again, she acted normally. They didn't say anything, but it definitely felt like they thought I was lying. I've spent the past year moving around just to get a few weeks of sanity back. Fortunately, I'm able to work remotely, but my kids are struggling in school. My youngest is always in trouble, and I'm afraid to even let her leave the house. It doesn't matter what I do, this thing always returns and it won't go away. I can't keep doing this to my kids. I want my daughter back. About 5 years ago, I found myself working in a corporate office in the middle of nowhere. I'm not going to mention specifically what state it was in, because the details will make it obvious to those who knew me that I'm the one they need to be looking out for. When I was in my early 20s, I took a job as a prison officer. It was a position lower on the totem pole, but pretty intense. Every day there was a possibility of being seriously harmed by the inmates. It was hard to know which of them you could trust when, in reality, you really shouldn't trust any of them. After 2 years working this job, my girlfriend at the time started being vocal about how concerned she was for my health. I was sleeping poorly, stressed out all the time, and getting sick often because I was so run down. We'd been talking about starting a family, and she wanted me to take better care of myself. I'm sure being with someone who was around dangerous people all day also had a stress level of its own, so eventually I agreed to start looking for other work. After about 6 months of job searching, I got lucky and landed an interview with a security company. It was sort of local, about a 45-minute drive from where we lived. To paint a picture, this city was in the US and known for being hot and dry. There's not a ton of vegetation, but there's a lot of red rock. It's truly beautiful if you can appreciate that kind of landscape. Since then, I've moved back to the East Coast where I grew up and come to terms with the fact that I'll probably never see that place again. I went through the interview process, which was intense, but made sense for a security job. I was able to skip a few things because I was coming from the Department of Corrections. Basically, they had my prints on file, an extensive background check. I had to be up to date on all immunizations and trained to handle extreme situations. But I got the impression from the interview that this job would be pretty chill, mostly sitting at a desk all day and checking people in. The first red flag should have been that the pay was so high. Actually, a little more than I'd been making at the prison, but I was happy to take it. For a few weeks, I was relaxed before my start date, and then I made the drive to what would become a very memorable building. The building was a high-rise of 15 floors. It was in a small compound, but nothing else was nearby. It wasn't technically in a town at all. The compound had concrete walls around it, and you had to badge in at a gate. This was weird, but not totally uncommon. A lot of tech companies use this kind of security too. Around the compound, outside the main building, there were a few cafeterias, a gym for the employees, the admin building, and a tiny medical building. It was a pretty nice setup, and I felt like I was taking a step up in the world. The first couple of months were quiet, and I was right. It was pretty much a desk job. I had no idea what the employees did, but most were dressed in suits or business casual. Their regular day ranged from 7 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. There was an overnight shift for security of 2 people on at a time, but I'd been hired for day shifts. That changed when one of my coworkers, who I'd come to like, had a family emergency and asked me to fill in for him. I figured one 11 to 7 shift wouldn't kill me, so I went for it. The night shifts actually made more on a differential, so this was a good opportunity to try it out and see if I can make it work for a little extra money. I worked the shift on a Thursday night with Benji, another guard who was on the younger side. He was very vocal about the fact that his uncle worked here and that's how he'd gotten hired. Nice kid, but a little too prideful. I tried to chat with him as we hung out at the desk and found out he didn't actually know what his uncle did there. Weird, but whatever. At around 1 a.m., a woman rushed into the building. After hours, employees have to badge in. I hadn't heard her badge in, and she was wearing denim overalls and a t-shirt. That put me on alert, but she had an employee badge that she showed me quickly and explained that she needed to pick something up on the 11th floor. I had her sign in, which she didn't seem eager to do, and decided that I would accompany her to the 11th floor because something seemed fishy about how she was acting. After telling Benji that I'd be right back, I got into the elevator with the woman and we rode up. She told me I could wait in the hallway, but she seemed nervous. So once she strode through a set of doors she had to badge into, I followed. These doors were opaque, and I'd never been to this floor before. Because I was getting the sense that something wasn't right, I caught the door with my foot and looked in after her. The entire room was filled with tanks. I mean filled. Human-sized tanks, too. And in them wasn't water, it was some kind of purple translucent stuff. I could hear the woman rummaging around and knocking over things that sounded metal. After a few moments, before I could get a good look at what was in the tanks, she rushed out with something carried tight to her chest. As soon as she saw me, she told me to get back to the elevator. I could hear sounds coming from the room, but didn't know what was happening. There was kind of a groaning sound. We got into the elevator and I'd asked her what she'd taken, trying to get it from her, but she managed to wrestle it away from me and elbowed me in the nose. My nose was bleeding badly and I couldn't see, so as soon as the elevator doors opened, she ran. I shouted for Benji to catch her, but he had his feet kicked up on the desk. He scrambled up, but she was already gone. As I cleaned myself up at the desk, I called our supervisor, who was always on call, and explained what happened. He was quiet for a moment and then told me to stay there. Within 15 minutes, what looked like a SWAT team showed up with a few other people I recognized as employees. The employees hurried to the 11th floor as the SWAT team searched the grounds. I had to give a statement, but never found out what the woman had taken or what was in the room. I just happened to leave out that I'd gotten a glimpse in there, and honestly, that probably saved my life. The week after, I was fired. They phrased it as a layoff due to overstaffing, but I knew it had something to do with that night. I dug around for a little while trying to learn more about the building and was able to trace the company back to the US government, but got no further because someone called me and told me to stop looking. That's it. No other explanation. And I listened, because whatever they had going on there was dangerous, more dangerous than the prison. I've moved around a few times since then and keep a low profile. I'm now working as an insurance agent. Hopefully I've given little enough info that the people who know about me won't come looking. But I just wanted to get that story out there. It's both a warning and a message to let others know that if they witness something they shouldn't, they need to keep quiet.